I want to talk to you this morning about the impact of BEE on the economy. And I thought one of the ways to do that is really to give an overview of the various affirmative action and BEE rules so that we have an overall picture of what it is that BEE is now requiring of business, because it leads directly, of course, to some indication of what impact it is having on the economy. So I want to start with employment equity and the supposed norm of demographic representativity, because it's very important that we should understand more about this norm. As you'll see, black Africans make up 75% of the economically active population, or the EAP. So that is the supposed norm, which business is supposed to attain at every level of employment, from the lowest right up to top management. But the economically active population, by definition, includes all those between the ages of 15 and 64 who work or would like to work. So in other words, it includes a number of teenagers, it includes a number of people who've never actually had jobs, though they would like the opportunity to work. And the black African population is a very young one. So we have the fact that more than half of black Africans are under the age of 25 years. If we start looking at black Africans which are of the right age for senior management posts and put that at, say, 35 to 64, then we see that black Africans of that age make up 38% of the economically active population, not 75%. And it's a very significant difference. In addition, black Africans with post-school degrees or diplomas make up only 5% of the economically active population. And because it's only relatively recently that we've had many more black matriculants coming out of the schools and going to tertiary institutions, many of these individuals are also younger than 35 years. If we look to employment equity in the public service, black people make up 81% of senior managers. That's according to the most recent report put out by the Commission for Employment Equity last week. And this is out of sync with the age and skills profile of the black population. It has been achieved through very rapid staff turnover, which in turn has resulted in a major loss of experience, institutional memory, and hence also capacity. And so we see, for example, that this is a factor in the backlogs in infrastructure and the government's difficulty in overcoming them. As Trevor Manuel said a couple of years ago, we lack capacity to get big projects off the ground. We also see within the public service significant evidence of financial mismanagement, relatively few clean audits, and successive Auditor Generals have constantly said that a key factor in this situation is the absence of adequate skills. If we look further to employment equity in the public service, in local government, Matthews Pulser, for example, when he was National Treasurer of the ANC, said back in 2009 that municipalities are in ICU because of affirmative action. He said so often people with the wrong skills have been appointed, and it would now be very necessary to do the difficult job of getting rid of those people, moving them out of local government and bringing in people with the right skills. But of course it's not easy to move anybody out of the public service given our labour rules. And the poor, of course, suffer the most because they are dependent on the state for the delivery of services. They have fewer opportunities to turn to the private sector and pay instead for what they need. And service delivery is very often poor, as we know. We have something like 80% of public schools dysfunctional. Many of our public hospitals are not working well. A critical factor in that, as the government itself recognizes, is poor management. Resources are put into the hospitals. We've had something like an 8.5% increase in real terms in the money going into the hospitals, but very often the results are poor. And an inefficient government bureaucracy also has major implications for business. And so for a number of years now, it's been identified as the third most problematic factor for doing business in South Africa by the World Economic Forum in its survey of global economic competitiveness. If we look to employment equity in the private sector, again, according to the most recent Commission for Employment Equity report, we have 27% of senior managers in the private sector being black, which is more, of course, in line with the black age and skills profile, though the government criticizes it very much. We see that black representation has gone up by 550% since 1994. That 57% of employers experience the poaching of their skilled black professionals, and that 40% pay premiums to either attract or retain their black professionals. And the figures on poaching and the premiums show a huge unmet demand for skilled black people at senior levels. And yet, under the Employment Equity Amendment Act, which took effect last year, firms now face fines of up to 1.5 million rand, or 2% of annual turnover, for their first offence in failing to meet racial targets adequately. And if there are repeat offences, then the fines go up. So the fine could reach 10% of annual turnover for a fifth successive offence within 3 years. And you may have read too that with the publication of this latest report, the Department of Labour says that there are something like 1,400 employers who are in breach of the relevant rules and who now face prosecution and these sorts of fines. If we start to look briefly at BEE for larger firms in terms of the codes, the new generic codes, which came into effect on the 1st of May, I'm just going to sketch very briefly the requirements that now apply to firms that have annual turnover of 50 million rand and more. And in essence, they must still have 25% plus one black ownership. But very much the emphasis seems to be on narrow-based BEE rather than broad-based, because only 3 points out of 25 will in future be available for ESOPs, for employee share ownership programs, and community trusts. And ownership is also a priority element where firms must meet a minimum score or they will have their level of BEE contribution reduced by 1 level. Then we come to management control, and the requirement is that there should be 50% black representation at board level, 60% at senior management level, 75% at the middle management level, and 88%, I beg your pardon, at the junior management level. And these, of course, these kinds of targets are out of sync with what the economically active population figures show us. They also now, in terms of amended regulations put out by Rob Davies in May, are binding sub-targets for African, Indian and coloured people. So in other words, in the past that you could meet your target for black people by, say, appointing more Indian people. And Indian people, of course, have had the benefit of better education, stronger family structures and so on for many years. But that will no longer be permitted. And you will have to appoint Africans according to their demographic figures, and Indians and coloureds and so on. It's not 100% clear that it's the national demographics that apply, because of course the Commission for Employment Equity does also provide provincial demographics. But there's also nothing to indicate that you can use the provincial ones. So at least there's a grey area there, and it may be that the government is once again pushing for the national demographics to be used, which would have particularly negative consequences for Indian people in KwaZulu-Natal, coloured people in the Western Cape. On staff training, there's a big increase. It has been 3% of payroll that's required. That now goes up to 6% of payroll, which for most firms is a really substantial amount of money. And yet, because people have been so poorly educated at school, and sometimes also tertiary institutions, that the foundation on which firms have to work is very bad, and this makes it more difficult to get real bang for your buck through employee training. Then there's preferential procurement, where a target overall goes up to 80% of the goods and services that businesses need. 80% should be bought from empowering suppliers. And there's also a requirement that if you want to get more points, then you should be buying 52% from either 51% black-owned firms or 30% black woman-owned firms. And of course, there are real questions as to whether we have that number of 51% black-owned or 30% black women-owned firms for firms to buy from. If we carry on looking at BEE for larger firms, enterprise and supplier development, 3% of net profit after tax must go to this, but now all of it must go to 51% black-owned firms, or it doesn't really count for any points at all. And again, this is a priority element where a certain minimum of points must be attained, or the consequence follows that your level of BEE contribution is reduced by a level. On socioeconomic development, it's 1% of net profit after tax, but that must now be provided for income-generating activities. Yet many of the charitable donations that are made by business go to orphanages, for example, or old age homes, where the beneficiaries are not trying to engage in income-generating activities. And so it seems that donations of that kind will also not attract points. On the original codes, most firms, according to a study done by the DTI, had in 2013 average scores of between 65% and 75%, which means to my mind that they had done quite well, despite the onerous nature of trying to comply with the then generic codes, the ones that came into force in 2008 and were expected to remain in force until 2017. But nevertheless, the new generic codes were introduced with effect really from the 1st of May this year. And it's a very different burden. It shows how easily the BEE rules can be shifted, and it is very much more onerous for business. And we look now briefly at BEE for qualifying small enterprises under the new generic codes. These are firms that have annual turnover of between 10 million and 50 million rand. They too have the 25% plus one vote BEE ownership requirement. Again though, this is a priority element, and compulsorily so. So whereas in the past qualifying small enterprises could choose 4 out of 7 BEE elements and could attain quite good scores without having to change their ownership structures, now ownership is a priority element, and if you don't reach the sub-minimum on this, then your level of BEE contribution is reduced. On management control, the requirement is 50% black representation at board and top management level, and 60% black representation for senior, middle, and junior management. The skills development is 3% of payroll that must be devoted to this purpose. Preferential procurement, the overall target is 60% of annual 60% of the purchases that firms make of the goods and services that they need. And here 15% are supposed to come from firms that are 51% black owned. On supplier and enterprise development, the requirement is 2% of net profit after tax, all of which again has to go to 51% black owned firms. And again, QSEs have to choose 2 priority elements. Ownership is automatically a priority element. They can choose to make the skills development or the overall concept of enterprise and supplier development their second priority one. If we continue looking at BEE for QSEs, socioeconomic development, again it's 1% of net profit after tax, again now for income generating activities, and now only 5 points are obtainable instead of the 25 that could have been earned in the past. In the past, when QSEs could choose 4 out of 7, they could earn 25 points on whichever 4 they could choose. So it's a very big difference, especially in this sphere. For family-owned businesses, effectively there's going to be a dilution of ownership, plus there seems to me to be a loss of management control. There's also, for many QSEs, mounting pressure to become 51% black-owned themselves in order to retain their supply contracts with larger firms, which are also very anxious to ensure that they buy enough from 51% black-owned firms. So, for example, I've had a couple of small firms approaching me saying, for example, that they've long supplied one of the big mining companies. Now the mining company insists that they must have 51% black ownership, or it will drop this firm from their supply chain. So it's putting great pressure on firms. And this, to my mind, amounts to indirect expropriation, the definition being that the state does not take ownership, but the existing owner loses most of the benefits and the powers of ownership. And BEE scores will drop, as I'm sure other speakers will say, despite the efforts to comply that have been made in the past. I'm going to move on now. Oh, I've got right out of sync. Sorry about that. To look at some of the other important BEE changes. The first is in the BEE Amendment Act, which makes fronting a criminal offence, which is punishable by fines of up to 10% of annual turnover, plus jail terms for directors of up to 10 years. Now, the DTI has often said that fronting is fraud and fraud has to be severely punished, etc. But actually, the Act defines fronting extraordinarily widely to include conduct which unintentionally undermines BEE objectives. Now, one must hope that the National Prosecuting Authority would be sensible enough never to actually try and prosecute anybody for this. But the BEE Commission will be able to investigate fronting of this kind and to name and shame firms that things are not doing well enough. I doubt whether we will actually see prosecutions and these kinds of punishments, but nevertheless, it seems an extraordinary thing that we should have put onto the statute book, the possibility of directors being sent to jail for this kind of misconduct. We also now have draft Treasury Regulations. These came out last week. As many of you may know, there's long been a waiting for BEE, where the state buys goods and services from the private sector. This is done under a 2000 statute, the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act. The National Treasury puts forward regulations under that act, and for a long time the rules, for example, if you're tendering for a contract worth more than 1 million, is that 90 points out of 100 are allocated on price and functionality, and 10 points out of 100 are for BEE status. And the Treasury has said that that situation in practice means that the state pays 10% more, 10% above market price, as it were, and that's very wasteful. So the 10%, the National Treasury has long resisted any attempts to push up the BEE weighting, but in draft regulations put out last week, the indication is that the BEE weighting will go up to 50 points. So 50 for price, 50 for BEE status, and the possibility that that means that the state will generally be paying 50% more, which will of course reduce the revenue available for goods and services and amount to what Helen Ziller, Premier of the Western Cape, called legalized corruption. If we look very briefly at BEE in mining, because this is part of the overall picture, all mineral resources have become vested in the custodianship of the state under the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, or the MPRDA. And this is effective expropriation without compensation, as we know from the Constitutional Court in the AfriSake case in 2013. It also means, of course, that there is now no possible ownership by black people. All mineral resources are vested in the custodianship of the state. They're simply not available for others to own. We've also seen that there are vague rules and hence their uneven application. And there have also been some extraordinary abuses, as happened a couple of years ago when mineral rights were snatched from Kumba. If you remember that, they owned 79% of the old order mining rights to their iron ore mine in the Northern Cape, and ArcelorMittal owned the other 21%. ArcelorMittal forgot to apply for the conversion of the old order mining right to a new order mining right. Kumba put in an application for that 21% before anybody else could do so, which should have guaranteed that the mining right would be awarded to it. But suddenly came Imperial Crown Trading, whose application seems to have been put in at a time when the long weekend pertained, and it seems that officials in the DMR, the department, may have helped Imperial Crown Trading copy aspects of Kumba's application, and then extraordinarily a prospecting right over Kumba's established mine was granted to Imperial Crown Trading, and it took a long time for the courts to sort that out. There will also be proposed now state control over beneficiation, exports and mineral prices under a mining bill, which was passed by Parliament but has now been put on hold. The new mining minister last year requested President Zuma not to sign it into law, and he's re-looking at the whole thing, but possibly with a view to making the rules even more draconian rather than easing them. A few more words about BEE and mining. As I've indicated, the amendment bill is still being revised,